Great. So welcome everyone to this fourth webinar of the series organized by the PSA Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group. I am Sonia Bussu, one of the conveners of the group, together with Hans Asenbaum, Dannica Fleuß, and Anastasia Deliguri. And today's webinar is titled Participatory Governance, how participatory systems interact with representative systems. And we have two papers today. The first paper is titled Framework for Measuring Transmissions by Dannica Fleuß and Christoph Deppe. And the second paper, All Public Participation is Local, Mobilization, Participation, and Context Effects by Katharina Huseljić and Marco Wähner, and apologies if I haven't pronounced your names correctly. Before we move on, I'd actually like to remind you a bit about a picture contest that the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Group has just launched very recently on reimagining democracy. And the idea is that the contest is open to students and early careers that are members of the PDD group and the PSA. And you just have to send us a picture, an original image and 200 words commentary that explains how this image interprets in your vision of democracy and how you'd like to reimagine it. The deadline is the 27th of October. There are 3 prizes, so you can win book vouchers worth £150. So 2 prizes will be awarded by a jury that we can reveal today. Will also include Chantal Mouffe and Michael Soward. And we have now introduced a popular prize as well. So the third prize will be decided by popular vote. So all the PDD members will be able to vote for their favorite image and online. So we'll give you more information about how to do that after the deadline. And all information about this contest is available on our website. So I'm a bit concerned because Rachel Walland appears as the main speaker on the screen. So I'm not sure what's happening, but I can see you're muted. So we'll ignore it. So hopefully you can see me in the main picture. But I have a feeling that actually in the recording, Rachel, you might appear as in the big screen. That's some sort of technical glitch, but we'll move on. So a bit of background about today's webinar, which is a merger of 2 interlinked panels that myself, Adrian Bua and Ricky Dean were meant to co-convene for the PSA conference that never happened, as we know. And so these 2 panels focused on embedding participatory governance. And the first one focused more on a systemic approach to the study of participatory governance, while the second one was more focused on the systemic practice of participatory governance. And today, coincidentally, we have 1 paper from each of the original panel. And so Dannica and Christoph's paper looks at developing a new comprehensive framework for a comparative large N assessment of transmissions of decisions, discourses, and arguments from the public spheres to empowered spaces of decision-making. And Katharina and Marco's paper looks at participatory governance at the local level, and specifically online processes, as they examine motives for participation and dynamics of non-participation and participation among disadvantaged groups. And so this is an all-German panel today, so we're going to hear a bit about some very interesting German cases. And to conclude the intro, I wanted to share some light on the rationale behind the two original panels, and particularly why we introduced this term of participatory systems and what we meant. So our intention was to look at institutional designs and developments in participatory governance that move away from a focus on specifically one-off forums, and there has been a lot of attention on occasional citizen assemblies, for instance, and moving instead towards more embedded systems of participation that might include different participatory spaces that can contribute in different ways at different points of the policy process. And so we see participatory systems as different from deliberative systems. So deliberative systems the deliberative system approach focuses on assessing the deliberative quality of the democratic system as a whole, while participatory systems look specifically at participatory governance. So forms of political decision-making that directly involve citizen participation. And the focus on citizen participation still allows us to borrow from the language of deliberative systems. So we use the concept of division of labor, whereby some elements, some participatory spaces, such as mini-public, might inject more deliberation into the participatory systems, while other participatory spaces, such as co-production, collaborative governance, or even participatory action research, will contribute different qualities equally important of inclusivity, equal influence, or grounding in lived experience. And so participatory systems in this respect also provides an opportunity to bridge between different literatures that focus on citizen participation but hardly speak to each other, such as participatory and deliberative democracy, but also the literature on co-production or the literature on community-led public engagement. Now, the two papers today don't necessarily engage in depth with this concept of participatory systems, and in fact, Dannica and Christoph's paper specifically, I think, anchored or developed the deliberative system approach. But I wanted to sort of give you a bit of understanding, because this term participatory system is quite new, and just in case some of you were baffled by its use. So I would now leave the floor, or the screen, I should say, to Dannica and Christoph for their paper. And feel free to share your slides, Dannica. And remember to unmute yourself.
So now I was really quick with this slide sharing thing, and sort of missed the point where I have to unmute myself. Okay, thank you so much, Sonia, for the introduction. We're very glad to present today our paper entitled Assessing Communicative Flows, an Integrated Framework for Measuring Transmissions Between Democratic Innovations and Empowered Institutions. This paper has been on our desk for quite a while now. It's also part of a bigger project that deals with deliberative systems. I think it picks up on the debates that Sonia just mentioned. So our background premise is that in order to contribute to this vision of a more participatory democracy, democratic innovations must be embedded within the democratic system at large and must have an impact on collectively binding decision-making, on procedures and empowered institutions. Now, both from a theoretical and an empirical perspective, having an impact can mean various things. Can refer to the transmission of decisions, of discourses, or discursive elements such as arguments and claims to empowered institutions. So the overarching aim of this paper is to provide a framework for measuring and systematically comparing the quantity of such transmissions between public spaces, or in that case, democratic innovations, on the one hand, and empowered institutions on the other hand. And we feel, and we will also demonstrate in the end, that this also promises insights for improving participatory means and innovations.
Sorry, Dannica, we can't actually see the slides.
Okay, I'm sorry, that's really weird. Because I'm sharing my screen, but okay. Now? Okay, can you see and hear?
Yes, now it's perfect.
That's perfect.
Sorry for this. Okay, so I'm just getting back to the second slide at this point. So more specifically, and against the backdrop of this overarching aim, we're addressing two research questions in this paper. So the first question is, how successful were Hamburg citizen initiatives during our analysis period in transmitting their discourses, arguments or claims and decisions to empower district assemblies? And our second question is, how does the successful transmission or the transmission of discourses, arguments and claims relate to the transmission of decisions, which means the actual realization of citizen initiatives' demands in collectively binding decision-making. So we're borrowing, as a conceptual background, from the systemic approach to deliberation. The most important concept at this point is the concept of transmissions. At a fairly high level of abstraction, we can say that transmissions can be defined as something that has a triple relationship. We have, on one hand, two sites within a system, in our case, democratic innovations and empowered district assemblies. And on the other hand, a decision object that we just abbreviate with TO that is transmitted between those sites. I referred before to the fact that different things can be transmitted in systems and between, in our case, democratic innovations and empowered institutions. And we distinguish three such elements. One thing would be decisions, so agreements about a course of action or results of citizen deliberation demands. But even if a decision doesn't get implemented or transmitted to empowered institutions in the end, it might still be the case that discourses or elements thereof, so arguments, ideas, claims, and justification that are part of discourses get transmitted to empowered institutions and to the debates led in them. In order to measure, in the end, compare the quantity of transmissions between democratic innovations on the one hand, empowered district assemblies on the other hand, we have three basic steps. So the first step would be to identify the potential interaction partners of a democratic innovation in the empowered space. In our case, that's fairly easy. It's always the district assemblies. And the second step, we raise the following question: how large is the share of topics that are, or of transmission objects, of discourses, decisions, or arguments and claims that occur in the democratic innovation and the citizen initiative, and that also occur in the empowered space. So in order to measure the quantity of transmissions between both spaces, the first thing we have to do is to figure out what are the contents in those political communications. And the second thing we're doing is basically matching them and trying to figure out where those contents overlap. For answering our research questions, we're mainly interested in one thing, and that is in the contents, in the decisions, discourses, and discursive elements that are communicated bottom up. so that originate in the citizen initiative and then are communicated and actually arrive at the district parliament or the district assembly. So that's why we're then calculating how large is the share of decisions, discourses, or discursive element that appear in the citizen initiative first. In order to translate that into research designs, we have two basic strategies depending on the transmission object. So in case of the citizens' demands and decisions, it's a fairly conventional approach. So we're having a look at what were actually the demands of citizens and citizen initiatives, compile a traditional data set of those decisions or demands, and compile a data set of the decisions that have been made by empowered institutions, and then apply quite conventional statistical analysis methods. In the second case, we have to deal with a bigger challenge due to the fact that we have to access large amounts of textual data that have been produced, so to speak, in citizen deliberations or discussions, negotiations, and also in empowered space discussions, negotiations. In order to have sort of a feasible approach to dealing with these large amounts of textual data, also in comparative analysis, we apply a computerized analysis tools. So that's structural topic modeling for those who may be familiar with it, and try to find out what are the basic contents of these political communications. And depending on what precisely we're addressing, arguments and claims or discourses, we back that up with a qualitative analysis. So in order to illustrate what the results were for our Hamburg cases and what sort of data sets and data we're dealing with, I'm now handing over to Christoph.
Thank you very much, Dannica. I will start by describing our data. We had to get data from multiple different sources. The first source that we used was the Datenbank Bürgerbegehren. It's a classical data set of all the direct democratic procedures in the districts in Germany. We only took the data for the districts in Hamburg. And so we had 149 cases since, I think, 1996. Then we only took the cases that have led to a referendum. Then we ended up with 29 bills. And we tried to collect textual data for these 29 bills. We quickly saw that it was not possible to collect data that is older than 2008 because the systems don't have it anymore. So we only had 20 bills left, but these were really good and we were able to find a lot of data for them. We used 3 different sources that are visible on the slides. And after grouping together the pro and con bills that focus on one issue, we are left with 12 issue-specific cases. Yeah, here you can see the possible pathways to a collectively binding decisions via the direct democratic institutions in Hamburg on the district level. So first, we have a proposal by the Citizens Initiative. They need to collect 2%, respectively 3% of the signatures in the electorate to get the Bürgerbegehren. And the Bürgerbegehren is the opportunity to have a negotiation with the district assembly. If the negotiation has a positive outcome, there's a decision in favor of the proposal by the CI. If the negotiation fails, the Citizens Initiative has the opportunity to launch a referendum. And if you have a referendum, you will have a decision either way. So that's the path you get to a decision. So long story short, the 2 interaction partners are always the Citizens Initiative and the District Assembly. Yes, and here you see the outcome of the 12 referendum bills. You can focus on the blue bar here. These are the referendum bills that were actually launched in public space. There are also referendum bills that are launched in empowered space. We don't focus on them right now. Just focus on the 12 referendum bills that were launched in public space. You can see that we have a very high success rate of 92% here. So 11 bills were successful, so they won the referendum and only 1 failed. We conducted a multiple STM analysis of our corpora. So we have a large text collection And sometimes we analyzed only the public texts, sometimes we only analyzed only the empowered texts, and sometimes we analyzed everything. We always took a verify, verify, verify approach, as is basically normal in NLP, to always verify our results with complementary close reading. And we reached a
2 minutes
preliminary...
left. Sorry.
2
minutes left. Yeah.
We reached a preliminary observation, basically, that both democratic innovations and district assemblies actually cover the same basic issues. However, the patterns, the discourses, differ quite a lot, and not all discursive elements that occur in democratic innovations also occur in the empowered institutions. So we have a very short sample case. It's about this beach. It's the most popular beach in Hamburg. And the district assembly had the plan to build a cycle path there. And it turned into a huge debate. 2 citizens' initiatives were formed. And of course, the district assembly was also a deliberative site. So we had 3 deliberative sites. Next slide, please. You can see here what the 2 initiatives were proposing, and you see the problem basically at hand. Next slide, please. And basically this referendum was a highly salient issue in the Altona district and in Greater Hamburg, and this is also very strongly reflected in our corpus. And we had very strong results from our STM analysis for the keyword Elbstrand. This was really important. So we used this keyword to get back down to the text and extract the very basic arguments of the 3 spaces. So basically the first 2 arguments that you see are from the public space, and the last text that you see is from the empowered space. And what we actually see is that the arguments from the public space are not really being taken up in the empowered space. So that's something that Dannica will tell you more about now.
Okay, thanks so much, Christoph. So now just summing up our results with regards to the research question that I pointed to in the beginning. So the the first question was, how successful were Hamburg citizen initiatives during our analysis period in transmitting both their decisions and their discourses, arguments, and claims to empowered district assemblies? What we can see, not only in this case, but also in this highly illustrative case that Christoph just outlined, is that citizen initiatives managed to be agenda setters for empowered space debates, but they're not successful in transmitting all or the majority of the elements of discourses, all arguments and claims that seem to be important to citizens. Interestingly, in all our cases, the negotiations between citizen initiatives and district assemblies failed in the end, and this led to referenda in the end. And at this referendum stage, 92% of the citizen initiatives were successful in terms of implementing their demands and the decisions they reached in the beginning they wanted to implement right from the beginning. So this is the more descriptive result. The second research question pointed towards the question, how do these different kinds of transmissions or impact of citizen initiatives actually relate to each other? And what we can see here on this low level, having a look at separate cases, but also at a higher level of aggregation, is that there's a discrepancy between the transmission of discourses and arguments and claims versus the transmission of decisions. And our more action guiding claim in the end so far is that it's actually something harmful that's happening. So there's a selective uptake of citizen arguments and claims that almost always leads to referenda in the end, which then are successful in terms of realizing citizen demands. So there's some room for improvement in Hamburg's participatory systems so far, and our claim would be representatives should probably be more responsive to citizen arguments and claims right from the beginning. This would maybe spare the public an additional and quite costly bureaucratic process and preventable referenda that sort of meet the demands of citizens in the end. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention at this point. And yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. Looking forward to your questions.
Very much, Dannica. So let's move very quickly to Katharina and Marco that are telling us more about participatory governance and online participation specifically at the local level. So feel free to share your slides. And remember to unmute yourself.
All right.
Can you see our slides? Or
Yes, we don't see the slideshow.
okay,
But
Just start.
don't worry, just make a start for now.
Okay. Then I will start. Hello, everyone. I'm Katharina. I think now you can see the slideshow. And together with Marco, I will today present our paper about resources and motives for participation. Yeah, and I will start with a short introduction of the thoughts we came from on online participation, because online participation as a new format makes new forms of participatory governance feasible, and has also there's also the possibility of increasing representativeness or reducing power structures in society by implementing these types of participation. But when we look at real-life participation procedures, what we often see is that they are framed by current power structures, so that some groups participate and are more likely to participate, while others are not. So we asked ourselves in the paper whether groups with different resources differ in the prevalence of incentives for participation. In the second step, we asked also if these groups differ in their likelihood for participation. And in the third step, we asked in which way different incentives increase likelihood for participation differently for the different groups in resources. And we worked with a theoretical framework for the definition of our resource groups. We worked with Bourdieu. We worked with types of capital that are seen to demark a person's position in the social space and thus their power. And we work mainly with two concepts here, with economic capital and with cultural capital. And we also use social capital as a control variable in our later models, but our main focus was on economic and cultural capital. So economic capital as money, cultural capital as education. And in the theory, these are assumed to influence a person's behavior, a person's ways of thinking, and thus we concluded that it may also influence a person's motives for political participation in online top-down procedures.
Yes, and now we have a short switch, and yes, our main argument is that participation occurs in response to several incentives, and this is based on, or the assumption is based on early works from Clark and Wilson. And first of all, purposive or collective incentives are very closely related to the stated goal of a participation procedure, and citizens might be motivated to participate because they have a perceived discontent with a public good, for example, a bicycle infrastructure. But purposive or collective incentives or as incentives are minor scope. because of the characteristics of a participation procedure, meaning that the chance that a single voice makes any difference is very low. But as we know from research, especially from research from political protest, is that citizens might overestimate their political influence, and that the perceived influence is at the local level higher than at the national level. Second, there are solidarity incentives, like a sense of duty to participate, or as well a strong affiliation to a city or to the neighborhood. And third and last, there are material incentives, meaning these are tangible or intangible private benefits. And these are not only financial advantages, but also time savings because of a better bicycle infrastructure. So we assume that incentives have a positively effect on the participation action, and we expect differences between groups, between resource groups, like Katharina said, assuming that not all resource groups benefit from incentives equal.
Okay, now I'm a bit confused because there's sound, but I will just go on. If I'm allowed to.
Sorry, whoever is speaking, we can hear some background noise. So if there's someone with their mic on, not speaking, please mute yourself.
Perfect, thank you. So I will go on, I will present the data we're working with. And we worked on survey data that was collected between May and July 2018 in 3 German municipalities, in Cologne-Ehrenfeld, in Bonn and in Moers. And we had a random representative sample from the population of the municipalities and a sample of the participants of 3 similarly organized participation procedures in the respective cities, which were the bicycle dialogue, so they got to decide about the bicycle infrastructure and changes in bicycle infrastructure. The survey was made after the participation procedure to let also people talk about their experience with that, which was quite interesting. So that's the data we worked on. We had, for the operationalization, I will rush through this because yeah, it's interesting to see, but we don't have so much time. We have participation is coded no or yes. Yes for participation and no if they didn't participate. We have the resource groups coded as groups with high capital on both categories, high economic capital, high education as high cultural capital, and the capital group with the lowest capital. For the incentives, we used the coding where a high incentive was indicated by high values, and as control variables, we added political efficacy, political interest, social capital, and gender. To test an equal understanding of the questions between all capital groups of interest, we used a measurement model. So we made simultaneous confirmatory factor analysis and tested for metric and scalar invariance, and we had equal understanding of the questions in all groups, which was quite good. And then we tested means.
And we tested means to answer our first question, our first research question, whether resource groups differ in their prevalence of incentives for participation. And we found different means. For example, for the material incentives, that the lowest means was found for low capital and high economic resource groups. Second, we asked whether resource groups differ in their likelihood for participation. And what we found was that low capital and high economic capital groups significantly participate less often in comparison to the high capital resource group. And at last, we asked in which way, we asked for interaction effects between incentives, the several incentives and capital groups. And first of all, what we found was that all incentives have a positive effect on participation. For purposive and material incentives, we found a highly significant effect. For solidarity, we only found the effect at the 10% confidence interval. And although we have differences between the incentives and the resource group, and we will show on the next two slides some graphics to make this more clear. First, we have the predicted probabilities. For the incentives, we only show the two high significant effects for purposive incentives and material incentives. And what we see here are the predicted probabilities, and the effect for the purposive incentives are stronger as for the material incentives. Second, we have the predicted probabilities for purposive incentives, but now we take a closer look on the effects for different resource groups, and what we see is that we have differences between the high economic and high education groups compared to the low and we have the strongest effects for the high resource groups and for the high education resource groups compared to the low resource groups and the high economic groups.
So we can come to the conclusion here that first, the prevalence of incentives differs between resource groups. Also, the resource groups differ in their likelihood for participation, and the incentives increase the likelihood for participation, but they seem to increase differently for the groups with low cultural capital in comparison to those with high cultural capital. So high cultural capital seems to be the most important effect here. What happens now? We worked, that's what we have to say for limitations, on a very special case study with these bicycle dialogues, because this was not a very attractive procedure for non-cyclists. They had no material benefits from it. And if you look at data on which group uses which modes of transport, you can see that cyclists are rather in the high capital groups, rather located in the high capital groups. So probably what we found is a bit biased due to that. But we found that the effect of the purposive incentive for this procedure is significantly weaker for the high economic reference to the high capital group. That's what we already said. And our next steps in our research process is to collect further data, because what we couldn't do in this presentation was to take a closer look at context effects, because we had not so many cases. But in the process, in our projects, we are collecting further data on different participation processes to make this possible. So I think that's it. We rushed a bit through the presentation, seems like, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharina. You can stop the slideshow, and yeah, that's it. That's excellent. Thank you very much. So that's brilliant. Some really, really engaging presentations, some really innovative methodological approaches as well. So are there any questions? I'm asking Adrian and Ricky. Are there any questions from the chat that you'd like to put to the presenters? Or otherwise,
There's none from the chat, but I have a question.
Okay, then let's leave it there and ask Oliver first to give his comments as a discussant. So Oliver is gonna draw out some main theme to kick off the discussion, and then we can open to the Q&A.
All right, great. Yeah, I don't think I'll take very long because I suspect there are a lot of people in the room who will want to interrogate different aspects. So I'm going to make a couple of points on each paper. I'm going to start with Dannica and Christoph's paper. I really enjoyed this, and I think it's a really good sort of foundational type of work, developing a framework that might support large scale or large end comparative studies. I think the field of democratic innovation needs more of those. We've been, it's a field that has been biased towards successful cases, towards case study methodologies. All of that is really important, of course, but we do need more comparative studies, especially at large scale. So I think that this is really powerful foundational work for that. I particularly like, I think, the distinction between three types of transmission objects. I found that very elegant: the decisions, discourses, discursive elements. I suppose that my main concern has to do with the implications for research methodology when trying to understand these different transmission objects. Because once you are trying to capture both depth and breadth, then it becomes harder to carry out large and comparative studies. So I wonder if the implication is that we need large scale mixed methods research designs, which in themselves are very challenging in terms of funding and resources and so on. But although it seems that things work quite well when you apply it to citizen initiatives, there might be other democratic innovations where you need ethnographic methods, and therefore, in order to try and study those three types of transmission objects, and that kind of complicates the aspiration of large and comparative work. I mean, it's just I suppose it's not a really tremendous barrier, but it's something to consider. What are the implications methodologically? And I suppose I was persuaded by how you deploy the framework in the case. The one thing that I suppose I find a bit more problematic is a more conceptual question about the concept of transmission. And I sometimes find it a bit problematic and I wonder if translation might do a better conceptual work, so that then this can be applied to other democratic innovations. And as I'm sure you're aware, there is a literature on translation in the sociology of science, in critical policy studies. And the main point of those who have been arguing to talk about translation rather than transmission is that, things transform as they travel, right? So these objects do not move in a mutable way. They evolve regardless of whether they are a discursive element or a discursive practice or a discourse at the aggregate level. Lots of kind of deliberative work or other types of activities within a direct democracy kind of setting, they produce things that get transformed along the way. Lots of speeches become artifacts, they become reports, they become, 20,000 words become 3 bullet points on an official report. All of that is not just transmission, it's translation. Something changes along the way. I think your case doesn't bring that up as much because there are very specific things built into, the signatures in a citizen initiative, the referendum ballots. These are very tangible things. But once you move the framework to other democratic innovations, things become a little bit more intangible, and translation takes place, and that brings us back to questions of power and the role of actors and so on. So I wonder if there might be something there to explore. You say that you're trying to determine the exact object of transmissions, and maybe these are not objects, these are more like what they call actants in actor network theory. These are artifacts and things that travel and do things along the way. So I think there's something interesting there to dig deeper. Maybe not in this paper, but I think it opens an interesting research agenda on this transmission versus translation kind of conundrum. And then the final point, I found it really interesting, the point that you make about elected representatives and how they could save public money, which is something they always welcome. or they say they welcome, by treating citizens' initiatives as trusted proxies and therefore save up on referendums. I suppose I would challenge a little bit. I want to push that a little bit. I want to push back on that because this seems to me quite context dependent. Because in this case, it does seem that the citizen initiatives were quite aligned with public priorities expressed in the referendum. But in other contexts, given factors like the self-selection bias, citizens' initiatives might not be as representative of broader consensus in a population. And one can understand the mistrust by elected representatives. So this takes us to the politics of public making, of constructing publics. And referendums are public making devices. They do not reflect a pre-existing public. They actively construct a particular type of public in time and space. And therefore, you cannot know to what extent the citizens' initiative was reflective of that public before that public is mobilized through the referendum. So I think that there is a bit of a paradoxical thing going on there. I'll finish with a question for Dannica and Christoph, which is, how transferable, I think this is really exciting, and we need to develop these kind of instruments. We do not have enough, and it opens a space where others who might be looking at similar issues might kind of contribute and expand. But I wonder how transferable is your methodology? Can it be applied to other local or national contexts? And can it account for a range of democratic innovations beyond initiatives and ballots? So for example, participatory budgeting or digital crowdsourcing, mini publics. I wonder, if it could be transferable. And moving swiftly, sorry, I already took longer than I said I would. Katharina and Marco's paper, also really interesting stuff in here, and I really enjoyed. I didn't, the paper was an overview, so I didn't get some access to some of the detail, and I have some concerns about how some of the variables might be operationalized, but I'm gonna keep things at a higher level and just make 2 points. I think I personally find it a little bit difficult to this notion of resource groups. And this is something that I think in deliberative democracy studies, most scholars will not find any issues with that. But that's sometimes more complicated from the sort of participatory democracy school of thought, because there, resource groups are less static and less homogeneous than the hypothesis that you're using assumes. The risk is that there is a flat depiction of citizenship, and participatory democrats think of citizenship as a developmental processes. So all these capitals that you are measuring and trying to operationalize are evolving. I don't know, I suppose I have some concerns, but maybe the variables, with a bit more detail into the methodology, there's not that much concern there. It's just something that came up. The other thing, and this is a bit more substantial, I think, you're taking a very positive framing. So take your conclusion when you say incentives increase likelihood for participation. That's a very kind of positive framing, but it could be flipped over. Because arguably incentives are not incentives, they are correctives, right? If we assume that our democratic systems are built to encourage some forms of participation and discourage others, then there is a systemic set of disincentives or barriers to participation. So what you are calling incentives, other people might call them, well, these are correctives to remove barriers to participation that make our democracies undemocratic. And I wonder, I think there is something really potentially powerful here by bringing the capabilities approach. I don't know if you've come across this. It's something that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have been developing over the last decade or over. And I think there's something interesting there about how to square something that doesn't assume the status quo as a starting point, which is what talking about incentives kind of does. I'll finish with a question that I suppose I'm just intrigued. There's a lot of potential here, and there are many interesting dimensions that can be explored at different levels of governance, across different policy arenas, different types of processes. So I just wonder what is next for your research on this. How are you planning to use these findings? It's an exciting research agenda. So just curious to see what you're doing next with it and beyond. Thanks.
Right. So thank you, Oliver, for raising some really good points. So if there are questions from the chat, and then obviously if Adrian and Ricky wants to use their co-chair privileges to ask their own question, we can start the Q&A with them, and then we're going to hear from the speakers their responses to Oliver's comments and to this round of questions that is coming up. So Adrian, do you want to start?
Yeah, I will, please, as I'm really excited by the paper I was meant to be getting questions, gathering questions for. So it'd be great to have a chat and read a draft. I didn't get a draft of the paper, but as I was reading the abstract, I was wondering and hoping, because I don't think you mentioned Bourdieu in the abstract, and I was hoping that you'd be using Bourdieu. I'm really interested in how you use Bourdieu, and I want to learn more how you operationalize his concepts. And also I saw the paper as an evaluation, and it's good to see the use of sort of sociological theory in evaluations, I think sort of going beyond simple policy analysis. And my question is related to this, so to the connection between theory and method, and it's also related, I think, to Oliver's comments about a capabilities approach, or I think I'd put it differently. So you say you're framing participation as occurring in response to incentives, and I think there might be a sort of epistemological inconsistency in using an explanatory model that's based on rationality, matching that up to a theoretical framework that's based on Bourdieu. And my understanding of Bourdieu, I'm quite new to Bourdieu, is that his theory of practice is not about rationality, but more about dispositions, you know, not about sort of rational calculation, but intuitions, or what he called a logic of practice, or a feel for the game, which to the observer might look like rationality, but is actually shaped by the accumulation of capital forms, which you do mention, that are embodied in habitus, right? And are developed through participation in different fields of social life. So to come to an end, sorry if I'm taking too long, I think the patterns you find are still really relevant as a kind of bird's eye view of the social differences in participation. And I might be misunderstanding, but I just wonder whether the focus on incentives, which to me implies rational calculation by your actors, is the right one. And maybe in a next step of research, I would say maybe a more ethnographic approach would get a better handle on patterns of inclusion and exclusion based on how agents interact in the field of participation, if we can think of participation as a field in Bourdieu's sense. So I guess the challenge there would be to look for how different forms of capital accumulated in different fields are transferred into the field of participation. And this way you begin to get into theorizing how inclusion and exclusion in the field of participation relates to and is shaped by the participation of agents in other fields like the economic or the social, in kind of, I guess, heteronymous kinds of relationships. But anyway, I'd really love to get a draft of the paper and maybe have a chat at some point, because I'm really excited by the use of Bourdieu to look at participation.
Adrian, is there any other questions from the chat as well that you'd like to share, or perhaps?
There wasn't any in the chat for Mark.
A couple for Dannica and Christoph.
Yeah, Ricky.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are a couple of questions for Christoph and Dannica, one from Veronica and one from Bruno. And they're both quite related, actually. And they also both relate to a kind of clarificatory question that I had, which is, so both the questioners ask about the role of either facilitators or translators in these processes. So is there like a role for mediators between the citizens and the decision makers, and sort of what kind of influence do these people have, linking to Oliver's comments about translation. And this linked to a kind of question that I had about this, because when you started talking about deliberative systems, I was a bit surprised actually that you were looking at citizens initiatives, because citizens initiatives to me aren't a particularly deliberative form of participation, right? There's usually a proposition and people either sign in favor of it or they ignore it. And so I sort of had just a question about where is the actual discursive work happening here that you kind of capture for the matching to the empowered spaces. And I think that then relates to maybe where these facilitators and translators could come in. We need to know where the discursive work is happening before we can see where these translators are coming in. I just had a couple of other quick clarificatory questions. So one is just this. So you talk about transmissions of decisions, but it wasn't clear to me exactly what the decision at time 1 and the decision at time 2 is, right? So it seems that decision at time 1 is maybe the collection of signatures. But again, for me, conceptually, this seems something slightly different from a decision. Is a collection of a certain number of signatures really a decision? And is that the decision that you're saying is then being transmitted either to the elite space or through the referendum? And is it a decision? And then I think also building on something that Oliver said with the match-up of the discourses, it seems that what you try to do with the method is to see how closely the discourses in that empowered space match the discourses in the public space. But if we think of the public space in sort of Habermasian terms as this freewheeling clash of discourses, right, we'd expect some discourses to fall out, right? Like there's a kind of clash of discourses, and the force of the best discourse wins out and should then be transmitted. So we would expect to see quite a lot of discourse falling out in this process between public space and empowered space. So the kind of, for me, the match, just a brute match between them doesn't really necessarily demonstrate processes of transmission. So I wondered what you thought about that as well.
Great. So I think it would be nice to hear a first round of responses from our speakers. And so Dannica and Christoph could go first, and then Katharina and Marco can follow and answer to the question that were put to them. And then we can open to the audience, and I can see already a few hands raised. So to you, Dannica and Christoph.
Yeah, so I tried to group the questions that came up now in 3 groups. So the first one would be conceptual questions with regards to our approach. So one thing was the question that Oliver raised, transmissions versus translations, and then some other issues came into play that were also addressed by other people. So I think I agree with the general claim that you made, that issues or discourses, arguments, and so on tend to transform while they're transmitted to other spaces. We use the term transmission at this point because it's an available term, which doesn't preclude the fact that things actually get transformed. But I think our conceptual framework and also the research design that we're using in the end is quite useful to address this issue, because one thing that we can do is distinguish between discourses and different arguments, claims, and so on. So the fact that discourses are transformed from the public space when they reach the empowered space, or that constellations of arguments are being transformed or something like that, is actually something that we take into account and that we can even analyze in more detail with this sort of a framework. So the second thing that came into play with regards to the translation and transmission topic was the role of facilitators. That's not the goal at this point in this framework, explicitly taking into account what facilitators do in this process or how things get transmitted. But what we can do once we have a measure or measures of transmissions between different spaces is use this as a context variable, or try to find out under what context, with what kind of facilitators, and so on, do things actually get transmitted particularly well or successful. The next conceptual question, I'm going to try to keep this short, raised by Ricky, was with regards to the discourses that we're addressing. So it's certainly, so in our cases, maybe that's the easiest way to go, we were dealing with the worked out proposals by citizens who actually proposed their arguments from different citizen initiatives. So it was maybe not a deliberation in the sense of a mini public and something where citizens actually engage in this specifically deliberative form, but there was this constellation of taking and giving reasons and arguments provided. The decisions that we addressed in the end were either those worked out citizen proposals and demands on the one hand, and on the other hand, the decisions made in commonly binding decision making. So it was not like the thing where people had to vote at this point. But, okay, the Habermasian notion of matching discourses and things getting lost, I think that it would be a different kind of theoretical discussion. And I think I agree with your point, basically. Maybe one thing that you can say very briefly is that successful transmission doesn't always have to be a good thing. So we're not evaluating this at this point. We're just trying to find out in how far do those discourses or discursive elements match. How we deal with that from a normative perspective in the end, if it's also can also be a good thing when discourses are not picked up from one space to the other, would be the next question from my perspective. Okay, very briefly, because I'm then going to hand over to Christoph for some methodological questions. With regards to the research design, one basic issue that Oliver raised was how do we balance depth and breadth, and how far can we actually access different kinds of democratic innovations with this research design? So the interesting part, I mean, there's a big diversity of democratic innovations, and it's a difficult term in itself, I'm aware of that. But the important or good thing for us would be that as soon as they're producing some sort of text or speech that we can somehow record, or that is somehow documented online or offline, in terms of proposals that give arguments, or in terms of live protocols and minutes and so on, we can include them in the analysis. We have to be careful about how to do it, back that up from time to time. I think that's what you always have to do, but at least we can sort of integrate them from this perspective. And with regards to the conclusions on referendums, the conclusions that I drew here were quite specific to the Hamburg case. Maybe Christoph wants to address that as well, because referenda are not always a bad thing or something. I didn't want to say that, but my point here was that just in the Hamburg case, they were actually more a sign of, okay, the negotiations failed, the representatives didn't really engage with that. That's also something that may be a bit more particular to the Hamburg institutional structure than like something that we would generalize from these cases. Okay, Christoph, do you want to address some of the methodological issues?
Yeah, I would also like to say something about the depth and breadth question, if I can say these words correctly. But that's really a good example for the blended reading approach. I'm going to interpret this methodologically, because because you start out your analysis with a quantitative analysis with the STM model, you can really go back into the corpus very specifically. You know what you're looking for, basically. You have the terms that are important, you look for these terms, and then you find the arguments. So you have the chance to really explore a really big corpus, and really you get to the important bits. So you don't need to read everything. You just zoom into the important bits, analyze them, code them, and then you got your blended reading approach. So this is like how you can really scale it to more. And as Dannica also already said, it's really applicable also to other participatory means, because as long as text is produced, or even if speech is produced, you can also really digitalize it into text really quick with modern methods. So we need text, and we need to be able to say if the text is basically public or empowered space, and then we can apply our framework. In regards to the referenda, this point really popped up because of some peculiar Hamburg cases. Hamburg is a huge city in Germany where rent prices are really high, and a lot of people have really unsurprising opinions. They want to keep their parks, they want to live cheap, and so on. And there were some referenda where I know that the representatives in the district assembly were quite sure how this was going to turn out. Basically, there were questions like, do you want to keep the park, or do you want to have a big development there? Like, if you give this to the public, of course the public wants to keep the park. This is just 200,000 euros spent for nothing, because you know it before. These are the cases we were thinking about it, and of course we don't want to dispute the value of referenda. Like the cycle path example, it was a salient question. It was good that the citizens were deciding on it. There's no question there, but the responsiveness really needs to be in the very clear cases. That's what we wanted to say also. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe like one brief remark in terms of producing texts and discourses and deliberations, something that we may discuss in the future, and probably not today, is like in how far are we actually addressing something like deliberation in all of these cases, or is it a more participatory systems approach that borrows from the deliberative systems literature as well? So probably not in all these cases we have deliberation in a very demanding sense. We have exchanges, communicative exchanges between citizens, and it depends a bit on the breadth of your concept of deliberation, if you want to call that deliberation at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you very much, Dannica. So to you, Katharina and Marco, to respond to your questions.
Yes, thank you first for the feedback, Oliver. It was very interesting, and we will really think about reading a lot more about the capabilities approach. I will try and answer the questions, or we will try and answer the questions. I think I will first answer the questions about how we brought Bourdieu together with incentives, or how we came to that idea. Because actually what we are observing, or I'm working sort of on participation procedures that deal with mobility, with sustainable mobility. Mobility is a topic where I would say that a lot of behavior, choice of modes of transport is quite habitualized. It is also a field where a lot of participation procedures take place, and where a lot of people get like to decide about infrastructural changes. And that's actually what I think we also find in the paper. People, due to their position in a certain field, use different modes of transport. So it's a sort of predefined behavior, how modes of transport are used, and what like the habitual mode of transport for a person is. And what we find here, especially for the material incentive, and what we found interesting was that the groups with the lowest resources actually had the lowest material incentive. So maybe the participation procedure was not for them because they were non-cyclists. So the actors from the municipalities that made like a procedure that was for cycling, or that was like talking a lot about the cycling infrastructure, simply did not reach these people, because it did not talk about their mode of transport, because their mode of transport may be like going by train, by bus, or walking, more in comparison to cycling. What you can also see when you look at other studies that reflect how people like move, or which modes of transport they use in a city. So I think this is quite interesting, and that the way in which people belong to these different capital groups we predefined shapes their behavior, but also influences their really how high their material incentive for a certain procedure can be. And when at the moment we are working on a big data set that is collecting many participation procedures in Germany that deal with the topic of sustainable mobility, you can see that a lot of them are dealing with cycling infrastructure basically, but there are not so many taking other modes of transport into account. And that's how we came to the thought of sort of linking the Bourdieuan approach, thinking about like how a position in a social place can shape a person's habitualized behavior, and what this in the end means for their incentives for participation. And in the data we can then clearly see that the incentives are not that high because these people that don't participate are not interested in the topic because they have like no material benefit from it. And they simply don't use the infrastructure. So that's how we came to it. There was one question about the operationalization and the methods we used for operationalization. So we used for the operationalization of economic capital, we used the income, the household income of a person. Because like what I said, economic capital for us meant the prevalence of money. And we split it basically in two categories because we wanted to keep an overview over the different groups we generate. So we took the median value and split it like the household income at the median value into two categories, one for high economic capital, 0 for low economic capital. For the cultural capital, we unfortunately could only use the institutionalized cultural capital, so whether how the school degree of a person was. And for high school degrees, which were above Abitur in a German context, we categorized them as group 1. The ones below we categorized as group 0. And that's how we got our 4 groups, one with the highest capital volume, one with the lowest capital volume, and 2 in between that had just a different division of economic and cultural capital. For social capital, what we used was whether a people was included in some kind of organization, whether they worked in an organization or were active in organizations in the respective city. Yeah. And I think I want to add something maybe. So for the further work, I can say a few things because in the project I'm working in, we're looking at the moment for other participation procedures that are dealing with sustainable mobility that are organized top down to like get a broader context to see if some effects are also robust in other contexts. But actually it's quite hard to work on that at the moment because some of the procedures, especially the offline procedures, are postponed or do not take place at the moment, which is sort of a problem because we should now like be doing surveys and field work. But this will follow during the next year. I don't know if you want to add something.
No, I think it was great. Thank you for yours.
So I'm conscious that we're running out of time again, but I can see 2 people that have had their hands raised for a while. So I'm inviting Michael and Anastasia to ask their questions, and perhaps then we can have one final round of very brief comments from the panel and close. So Michael, are you still around to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Great.
Good morning. Morning for me. So I want to follow up on some of the stuff that Oliver and Ricky asked Dannica and Christoph just real quick. And I'm just interested in your thinking about this. I think this is great research. I think it's excellent. So I kind of was thinking of Habermasian sluices as well. I mean, I think that's the image I got up at this intersection of participatory democracy and representative democracy. But the questions I had were about it. If I read correctly the quick presentation, and I don't know German, so please forgive me for that. There were actually people on each side of the issue in the process. So I'm not quite sure. That wasn't clear in terms of who's doing the initiative, and then which discourses are being taken up or not taken up. So are you saying that they're not taking up either side, or they're not taking up the side that ends up winning, which is something that's very, very different? And the reason why I ask that is maybe what you're tapping into. And I've seen this in my work with John Gastel on the Citizens Initiative reviews. in the United States where they actually have mini publics connected to initiatives. So you actually have three different groups. You have the empowered people, right? The legislature, those kinds of people that have that power. You have the people like what it sounds like you have, which is the people interested in the initiative, either for or against an initiative. And then we have this separate thing that's this small representative deliberative mini public. And in watching the interaction between those two, it's clear that the logic of being for or against an initiative leads them to certain kinds of discourses that are not about deliberation, but are about winning the referendum and the initiative. That they try to cast it that way. And it's very strategic, I guess, is what I want to say. So whereas elected officials or even little deliberative mini publics, they have different logics. An elected official, has to get elected and presumably doesn't want to tick off either side if the initiative goes to a referendum, right? I mean, there's no incentive for them to pick a side if it's going to lead to negative stuff for them. And deliberative mini publics have the initiative kind of, how can we work together and figure out kind of some sort of maybe compromise or work together. So I'm curious if maybe that's what you're tapping into in terms of the different constellations of discourses you're getting and findings you're finding.
Stasia, would you like to ask your question before we give the mic to the panel?
Yes, thank you, Sonia, for that. First, I would like to thank the speakers for their very interesting presentations. And I think both papers have actually showed the importance of setting up a theoretical framework in how we analyze all these links between what happens in these participatory deliberative spaces and what happens actually to institutions, because that's usually the weak point, how you link these two and you allow this interaction take place. So I will just try to, according to also what Oliver has noted down about this term of translations and what Dannica and Christian said about transmissions, if I understand correctly from what Oliver and said and Dannica has responded, so this kind of transmissions is more, the concept is more constructive one rather than a direct transmission. So it actually takes into account what Oliver said, which also then on the other case makes this, the detection of these transmissions much more difficult, because if they are translated somehow, then you might not be able to detect them. But when you have a more comparative study, sources are actually displayed or understood or taken into account, it's much more easier to understand that while when you have kind of translation, sometimes it's not actually that easy to detect them. So it takes much more work, I suppose. And taking from this point, because I know we are already out of time, Dannica, have you gone any further to see, because you have mentioned that there's a selective uptake of citizens' arguments and discursive elements. Can you elaborate further on that, on which elements, which discourses, also following the question of Michael, are taken into account, which are the others that really don't make their way or don't go through this kind of empowered institutional places? I don't know whether you have reached that level of research or something in the progress. So thank you very much for this framework, which also shows how important it is to have theorists and
Great, Dannica and Christoph.
Yeah, if I might just respond to Michael. Your hunch, even if you don't speak German, was right. The third empowered opinion was a neutral opinion, but in the history of this particular case, and I'm really just talking about this case, the empowered space flip-flopped between positions. And in the end, they just said, okay, let's do this referendum and have it over with. So this is what happened. But I see Dannica is shaking her head and she wants to say something.
I'm not. No, I don't want to oppose you. You were talking about that case. I was just thinking about like the angle I think Michael was coming from in terms of.
Really, it was only this case. My answer.
So he's bashing me for not being able to deal with this like computerized analysis tools so well. So we have this mutual thing. That's good. Anyways, no, I think the angle Michael was coming from was the question, is this actually a strategic situation that you're analyzing in these cases, such that from a Habermasian perspective, let's say communicative action wouldn't even be expectable because two sides are arguing against each other and tend to frame and form their arguments and reason-giving processes in that way, right? And in this one case that Christoph also just like addressed again, there were two sides, so to speak, in the public space on behalf of the citizen initiatives, but this is not always the case. I think it's really not the predominant case in the amount of cases that we analyze. Usually you have one citizen initiative that gives reasons and argues, and then it's also spread into like the broader public sphere, at least in Hamburg media. And so you have more like one direction and citizens arguing, taking reasons, and then forming a citizen initiative. This probably from that perspective, a rather untypical case, although it's also a highly illustrative case for other reasons. So with regards to what Anastasia was asking, yes, so we're taking sort of a constructed concept of transmissions. Maybe that's a good way to put it, because what we're actually not doing is tracing the process. So tracing all these all these different processes would be a different approach, and would be very, very resource intensive for all these cases. So what we're doing here, that's why I was sometimes in the paper, but also in the presentation, talking about approximating or delivering an approximate measure. What we're doing here is basically assessing these overlaps in contents or topics. This may mean, and this is always about balancing parsimony and something like in-depth research. What may happen here is that we're not seeing something, that we're losing something, that we're at a fairly high level of abstraction. One thing to answer to this would be, okay, we're backing this up with selected close readings whenever we feel that it may help, or we cannot explain something in terms of the results. The other thing would be, there are many qualitative studies and process tracing analysis and so on of these participatory processes. What's not there so far is really a framework for comparing and assessing these processes. And I think it's not like that's the better way to research participatory processes and deliberative processes and systems. It's just that that's something that can really help to answer very specific research questions, or to have a starting point for other in-depth analyses. So it's really from this perspective on certain research problems that we think it's a useful tool to have, and a useful approach. It's not answering all sorts of questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dannica, and all the speakers. So this has been a fascinating discussion. So many questions that I would like to ask myself, but we're really running out of time, actually way over the ending time that we had in mind. So I would say let's close it here, and we're now taking a short break. So we're going to be back on the 2nd of September for our second last webinar, titled Democracy and Space from Participatory Sides to Translocal Spatialities, with papers from Hans Asenbaum, Jan-Peter Vosch, and Dannica Fleuß, and Marta Wokuczewska. And I'm probably mispronouncing many of these surnames, so apologies for that. But I would like to thank once again all our speakers that presented some really fantastic work with some really interesting innovative methodological approaches, our discussant Oliver, and my co-chairs Adrian, Enrique, and a big thank to all the audience and all the people that are still here, even if we're about 15 minutes late. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the summer, and we're gonna see you again in September. Bye.